All right, well, hello and welcome to the next episode of the Untrodden podcast. Today, this time, I'm joined by Jensen Suther, who is a fellow at Harvard and has a new book coming out called True Materialism. It's coming out in about a couple weeks. Check it out, and we're going to be talking about that book and also about Hegel in general, because he's, somewhat of a scholar of Hegel, has published about Hegel, and yeah, that's what we're here to talk about today. So, my understanding of your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but broadly what your book is doing is it's got two main things which are directly related to each other, not necessarily separate, but it is establishing kind of the view of like the subject as life, beginning in Aristotle, and expanding in Hegel to have full like self-reflection and an understanding of the human subject as a self-reflective conscious agent that kind of makes its own subjectivity in that way. And then you're also looking at, of course, Marx is in that picture as a way to understand particular forms of organization and how that affects consciousness, not necessarily as a philosophical difference, but a different way of looking at a necessary way of looking at that problem. And then the second part of the book is looking at specific authors and modernism and how that they relate to this problem of subjectivity, and how art as a distinct area of existence is like it's related to subjectivity. It's its own thing related to subjectivity, and it's not necessarily determined by economics or something like that separately. So yeah, I think these are like the main two themes of your book. But yeah, what would you add to that?
Great. Yeah, no, that's I think a fair broad strokes characterization. I would maybe divide it into three main interventions. We can say like the Hegel intervention, the Marx intervention, and the modernism intervention. On the Hegel front, partly what I'm trying to do is to show that there's been this huge interest in recent years in Hegel's conception of life, um, which I think is very important. Partly what I've tried to take up is the accounts given by people like Robert Pippin, Robert Brandom, John McDowell of Hegel as a thinker of uh, um, a thinker of social practice, a thinker of modern institutions as rational in a distinctive way, and to add to this understanding, a sort of notion of Hegel as also a thinker of what it means to be a living being, and specifically what it means to be a rationally living being.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my, in the book, chief interlocutors is Robert Pippin. His work has been extremely important for me. One of the many achievements of Pippin's work is to try to show that Hegel develops a method for thinking about like what sorts of institutions, what sorts of social institutions would be rational. And he does this in a very elaborate and brilliant way. And he also tries to show that part of Hegel's account is premised on the idea that we have to overcome any kind of hard dichotomy between reason and desire, meaning that Hegel's picture is not just about, what are the sorts of institutional conditions for satisfying our desires as private, discrete individuals, but nor is it a sort of idealized account of what, like, institutions would be rational independently of what agents would actually want and take satisfaction in. Pippin is trying to show that these two points come together and that no agent just on the basis of their own desires and needs and inclinations can actually be indifferent to these rational institutional structures. Everyone is ultimately desiring these rational structures, which on the sort of classic Hegelian account consist in the sort of bourgeois nuclear family, civil society, and the state. Now, I think that Pippin has shown that such an account is necessary. I think he's done a tremendous job and made this great contribution to the development of world spirit and showing that this is the sort of account that we need. But I think that what he's left out is the idea that this really requires attentiveness to Hegel's conception of life and specifically of what it means to be a rational animal. And the only way that we can actually demonstrate this identity between desire and reason, which Pippin's whole project has sort of been committed to, is by turning to Hegel's notion of life. Now, other people have emphasized this, like Karen Ing and Thomas Carana and Frederick Neuhauser, Jay Bernstein. But what I would say is that Hegel's a deeply Aristotelian thinker. He wants to think about how, um, you know, desire is a product of a communal process of habituation. And he wants to show that we are a very unique kind of animal in that how we become initiated into a form of life is through this process of learning what counts as a good reason, what counts as a good reason for what. I mean, for example, like you take emotions like anger and sadness, and these aren't just like non-rational affects for Hegel. They're embodiments of reasons. When you feel sadness, you have a reason to feel sad, or when you feel angry, you have a reason to feel angry, and those are embedded in the feelings themselves. So the basic idea, what I'm trying to hammer home, is that Hegel is a kind of naturalist because he does want to show that desire and reason are inseparable. And his way of demonstrating this is through the category of organic or living form.
Mm.
So that's one part of the intervention. The other part of the intervention is to show, with respect to Marx, that more or less that Hegel is providing a as everyone knows, like Marx has a critique of Hegel. He has a very um, sort of robust critique of the Hegelian project. But what I think goes missing from Marx and from the Marxist tradition more broadly is an understanding of the way that Hegel is incorporating the notion of life and the way that he's trying to ground reason in living form. And because of that, because of this neglect, it becomes much harder to see what the relationship between Hegel's idealism is and what Marx's materialism is.
Mm.
So part of the idea is to show, with respect to Marx, that um, if we take Hegel's notion of life seriously, and if we show that his notion of reason is grounded in life, that you get what I call like and what Marx himself calls a true materialism, meaning that we can make sense of um, what a conception of human life with all of the sort of attention to need and desire and embodiment, we can actually give an account of that. Um, but we can only do so by grounding it in the Hegelian notion of reason. And this is because Hegel's able to demonstrate that what reason is a distinctive way of being a living being. It's not something separate from life. It's actually deeply inseparable from what it means to be a living organism. So once one takes that on board, it transforms, the Marxian project, because then one can see Hegel's logic, one can see Hegel's project more broadly, not as a competitor to what Marx is trying to do, but actually as a kind of philosophical justification of the categories that Marx is employing.
Mhm.
And that's what I'm trying to show via Marx. So that Marx needs Hegel's notion of life, which in early texts he's indirectly relying on through his engagement with Feuerbach, like in the economic manuscripts. Um, and also he needs Hegel's account of institutional rationality, Like, how do we justify what sorts of institutions are rational? Marx wants to say that communism is the riddle of history solved.
mm,
Great. What does that mean? Well, partly what Hegel is giving us is an account of how one would justify that kind of claim. And, part of the task of philosophy and of critical theory or whatever, yeah, it's to be able to give, an account that's justifiable to other people and to convince them that your way of seeing the world and your way of understanding emancipation is true.
mm,
So basically, I want to show that, Hegel is committed to a project of justification that Marxism actually needs, both for like uh, sort of theoretical debates between Marxists, but also more practically speaking, when we think about matters of organization, like how you organize, workers and how you organize people on the basis of notions of class struggle. Like, what is the conception of the good life that you're organizing people in light of? Like, what vision of the world do you have such that you think that your vision is better than others? And I think Hegel gives us a way to do this. Now, this is not to say that Hegel's own vision, like in the philosophy of right, is correct.
mm,
I think part of the point for me is that Hegel had not only blind spots, but he also just didn't have the historical experience
mm,
that Marx ended up having. And so, Marx has a deep advantage when it comes to that. Um, and to put it in a slogan, I think Hegel is right that we need something like a philosophy of right. And by a philosophy of right, what Hegel means, as he says, what right is it's the totality of the conditions of freedom. I think we need a philosophical account of what the totality of the conditions of freedom are. That does not mean that Hegel got those conditions right. That
mm,
doesn't mean that he correctly articulated what they are.
mm,
I think Marx comes closer to articulating what those conditions are when he says things about, communism being the riddle of history solved, and in the sort of rare moments when he does tell us what communism is, um, yeah, Marx is closer to a consistent notion of what emancipation would be. Um, that being said, Marx lacks Hegel's philosophical resources for grounding
mm,
his idea of how to get to this sort of understanding. So the idea is to take the philosophical resources from Hegel, the political and economic resources from Marx, and to really synthesize them to give a coherent account of what a kind of materialist, a historical materialist project would be, or what I've called in some of my recent papers, like a hylomorphic materialism.
mm,
Now, the final piece of this, which I'll be more brief about, is the first part of the book tries to make this argument about Hegel and Marx and how they mutually can function as, means of self-correction. In the case of the second part of the book, it's about the modernist novel, and I'm reading Kafka's The Trial, Mann's Magic Mountain, and Beckett's The Trilogy. And what I want to show with these three works is that in the case of Kafka, it's law. In the case of Mann, it's the institution of education or Bildung. And in the case of Beckett, it's narrative or literary form itself. Um, that given this renovated Hegelian Marxist frame that I'm trying to develop, we can understand these works as major testaments to the contradictory attempts in bourgeois modernity to realize the ideal of freedom in these various institutional contexts: literature, education, and sort of the classic really Aristotelian sense of like habituating people to a form of life, and in Kafka's case, law, like the norms or rules or reasons that we're giving to ourselves collectively. I think that each of these three authors is contributing something really essential to a theory of modernity and to modernity's contradictions, understood along the lines of this idea via this sort of renovated Hegelian Marxism of yeah, a self-contradictory attempt to that modernity is a self-contradictory attempt to realize the project of human freedom. And what's self-contradictory about it is that, said in a slogan, um, we are trying to realize ideas of freedom, equality, democracy without sufficient attention to um, what it means, how these things are essential to realizing our capacities as living beings, um, and how these three things can't be formally separated from our status as animals, but are actually essential to our realization of ourselves as the very peculiar sorts of animals
Mhm.
that we are.
Right. So would you say something like that the way that you look at law in Kafka and would you say that that has something to do with our legal tradition in the United States, for example? Would you say that that kind of critique, that kind of understanding of the bourgeois, because obviously what a lot of people will do is they'll just say, well, that's all well and very historicized way of looking at things, where okay, that's all well and good for the 1800s, maybe even the previous like the 1900s, but we live in a different time now where our institutions have reached a greater level of um, efficiency and legitimacy. And so, yeah, would you maintain that kind of critique of the legal system grounded in Hegel? Do you think that maintains from your analysis to like the modern day legal system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's persistent in that, like, partly what I think Kafka is demonstrating, and and this is sort of a classic Marxist critique, is that you have like in modern bourgeois society a certain legal formalism where laws are generated procedurally. It's not so much about what would best satisfy individual need or what would best satisfy uh, you know, um, individual happiness or interest, but it's really about, you have a formal system of laws and you can deduce further laws from within that system. And in a certain way, it runs parallel to uh, how individuals are actually trying to live their lives. And I think that, unlike the like Lenin and State and Revolution and other places, and this is an Aristotelian thought as well, that what law should be is a system of rules that are internalized by individuals and in which they themselves can find satisfaction. They're not just, you know, externally imposed formal structures that appear as a kind of prison house, but they actually allow for our satisfaction as, the kinds of animals that we are. Um, I think that any form of life is going to require some notion of law, legality, or rule, including a communist one. Um, I think this sort of legal formalism that we have under capitalism and bourgeois modernity, it's actually antithetical to the satisfaction of individual need in many ways because it's designed to protect, um, you know, it's designed to protect property rights. It's designed to protect the standpoint of bourgeois right. And partly the point for Marx and for others is not that like we need to get rid of rule following altogether, but it's rather that we need a form of rule following that is actually conducive to individual flourishing and self-satisfaction beyond the form of property. Because as it exists now, like the sorts of rules and laws that we have, they generate an opposition between one class and another. Like as soon as you have, um, you know, uh, like on the one hand, and this is the contradiction, the laws are formal in the sense that everyone is supposed to be equal before the law. On the other hand, the way that the laws actually function, the way that the form of life that they actually preserve is one in which you have a very sharp opposition between a propertied class and a non-propertied class. Just in protecting the notion of property, even though anyone, formally speaking, has a right to property, as soon as you have a right to property at all, Marx's point is that you've already instituted distinction between a proletariat class and a bourgeois class. You've already created a system of, as he says, inequality. And so you already have a contradiction between what the law purports to be, which is, equitable to everyone, and what it actually entails in practice, which is a deep discrepancy between two classes of individuals. And this is just like analytically true of any capitalist system. I don't care if it's the 19th century or today. This is just constitutive of what it means to be in a capitalist society. Um, and partly what I think that an author like Kafka is bringing to speech is the way that uh, laws, which are supposed to protect us and shore up our freedom, end up being forms of domination and unfreedom,
Mm,
ultimately. And I think that that account retains its purchase. And this is why I think that this is a novel that we need to continue to read and think about and, try to give a critical account of, precisely because, like, it's the most powerful statement that we have in many ways of the form of sort of legal formalism in modernity. And by legal formalism, I mean a system of laws that are, uh, formally, um, everyone is considered equal, but substantively, it doesn't actually entail
mm,
equality. It entails a deep form of inequality and injustice.
mm. Okay, another thing I wanted to ask about is your. You obviously a big part of what you're doing is synthesizing Hegel and Marx. It's obviously a huge, consistent controversy on the left of how much to include Hegel. And so one of the things I was looking into some arguments between Chris Catron and McNair from the Communist Party of Great Britain, and he basically made the argument that Marx was more of like a Lockean empiricist. I mean he really did denounce Hegel as like kind of a reactionary, just trying to justify Christianity, the monarchy, whatever. And one of the ways he did this is he said basically that Marx like briefly uses Hegel and then he kind of moved on. But I was curious about that because my understanding of Marx's engagement with Hegel, my personal understanding was that it started off at its most critical, where he wanted to distance himself from Hegel, while still relying on like that kind of conception, as you said, but distancing himself at the beginning. And then my understanding is that by the time you get to Capital, Marx is very much using a Hegelian method, and he even acknowledges that he was more Hegelian than he might have realized before. And so that was my understanding, is actually that Marx became more Hegelian, if anything, or more acknowledging of his Hegelian roots over time. Whereas McNair was arguing basically the exact opposite, that he just completely disavowed Hegel. So what is your perspective on that? Where do you think that misunderstanding comes from?
Um, so, look, I mean, in the Grundrisse, which, were sort of Marx's notebooks for, uh, on the way to writing Capital, Marx is still retaining, many of these earlier categories. I mean, he's still talking about Gattungswesen or genus being. He's still talking about purposiveness, like in this classical sort of Hegelian sense. He's very much still embedded in this Hegelian, not just rhetoric and recognition. I mean, Marx has this very overlooked but absolutely brilliant account of recognition in one of the early notebooks, I think from like 57 or 58, um, in his Critique of Proudhon, of he has this brilliant account of like, utilizing these Hegelian logical categories to talk about recognition and a modern market economy. And uh, so I think on the one hand, like, of course, like, there's no question that Marx is still using these Hegelian categories to think about these things. Um, in the late 50s, up through the composition of capital. But even in capital itself, I mean, how does the book work? I mean, he starts from the commodity form. He starts from what he calls the simplest sort of category, and then wants to work up to, the supposedly more concrete categories like population. But the idea is that, Marx is ultimately trying to do a kind of synthetic deduction of what it means for capitalism to be capitalism. Like if you start from the notion of the commodity form, and that's the basic unit of exchange, and that's the basic way that we're thinking about um, our economy, then Marx thinks all of these other things follow as just entailments, and that he can deduce from that basic position, all the way up, even to an account of like primitive accumulation. Like, well, okay, once we have this in place, then we can give an account finally of how all this gets started. Like, what must be true of the beginning of a form of life, given the commodity form as its analytic basis. So he's still thinking in sort of an a priori mode, meaning that he's thinking purely, not in an empirical way, about what must be true of any capitalist system as such. That doesn't mean that there aren't empirical points that he's making. That doesn't mean that there aren't empirical observations that he's making and trying to make sense of in light of these categories that he's deploying. But Marx is clearly committed to a theory of categories, of principles, in light of which he can render economic forms intelligible. He's also still committed to a certain idea of what it means to be a human being as distinct from other sorts of beings. I mean, there's the famous passage in Capital about what's the difference between ants and bees and human beings. This is not an empirical claim.
Mm.
This is a claim about how we have to think about what it means to be a rationally productive animal versus an animal that's not rationally productive. So, and I mean the cherry on top is that, especially in the appendix to the volume on the Capital Volume One, Marx remains committed to a notion of alienation.
Mm.
Alienation shows up all over Capital, but especially in the appendix. And partly what Marx wants to say is that, workers are alienated from machine technology, which they regard as, which seems to be like a property of capital rather than a product of their own labor. And partly what he means by this is that, um, our own social relations show up as, uh, not as our social relations, but rather as properties of these external things. But he's also saying that, for that claim to be true, for that to make sense, the thought has to be something like, yeah, that we are the kind of being that has to externalize itself, meaning that, you know, uh, we make ourselves into capitalists and laborers by laboring and by expropriating the resources of laborers. It's in doing that that we make ourselves into capitalists and laborers. Um, this is, Marx's sort of Aristotelian, Hegelian notion of self-constitution. That how do you make yourself into a teacher? Well, you make yourself into a teacher by going out into the world and teaching. These are the sorts of, practices that you participate in to make yourself into what you are. And in the case of alienation, there's a kind of misrecognition where you don't see that you are responsible for making yourself into what you are. You think that something else is making you into what you are. And in the case of capital, Marx wants to say that we think that we're beholden to the machines, that they're forcing us to do what we're doing. We think that, and this makes a difference. It's not that this is just simply false or an illusion, uh, but it is also the case that this is a form of misrecognition. And this whole idea of misrecognition or alienation, well, where the fuck does it come from? I mean, it comes from Hegel. I mean, Marx is taking this idea of a form of externalizing yourself in the world, making yourself into a teacher by producing students, by, producing lectures, by producing papers. You know, you make yourself into this by externalizing yourself. And what happens when that form of externalization starts to appear as something that is separate from you, that isn't you? And that's what capital is.
Mm.
And the theory of that kind of externalization, which amounts to a form of alienation, that's a fucking Hegelian thought. And that's the thought that Marx continues to think
Mm.
up through Capital.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and really, this is something that you're very consistent about, from what I can tell, is that you really need. It's a defensive metaphysics, I guess, a defensive philosophy, because obviously on the left there's a lot of people who distinguish themselves from even caring about philosophy at all, thinking
Yeah,
that we've like moved on from it, or it's like a particular historical form or something like that. And you're very consistent that we need these metaphysical arguments like this grounding to make any sense of it whatsoever, right? I mean, if you look at Lenin and Marx, both of them also felt that way, that you needed some philosophical resources. And of course, this is like a big argument which we can get into. But I wanted to ask, about some of that grounding, because I'm loosely familiar with Aristotle. I mean, I know Aristotle's Politics because that's what you do. Um, and I'm familiar with the idea that Aristotle has kind of like a naturalist. He's very interested in nature, and he's deriving like purposes of things and of life, through nature, and that these are very, these are connected, and that this is obviously has a huge Christian history, where people like Thomas Aquinas basically argued that, we can use this understanding of nature to understand the world and theology, and fundamentally, like, nature is God, right? I mean, like, nature is comes directly from God, and so having this enriched understanding of nature, I'm familiar with all of this in Aristotle, but I'm curious about what you think is missed, about Aristotelian, metaphysics, I guess, and about, what exactly is the justification that he provides for thinking of life in this way, and what are people missing? What is the crucial, metaphysical insight that people are missing from Aristotle that goes as far back as that obviously Hegel is
great.
following.
Perfect. Perfect. So a couple things. I mean, so one, it's really important to state that like Aristotle in book 12 of the Metaphysics, Lambda, I mean, he um, is actually quite emphatic. He says that he points out that the sort of religious myths that people conceive to make sense of the generation of the world and of living beings and so on, that Aristotle himself already says that this is a kind of picture thinking, that this is not actually how it works. He says that, really it's about, um, the famous definition that Aristotle gives is that, well, what is God? What is the fundamental principle of the universe of what is? It's thought thinking itself. It's thinking, thinking, thinking. And for Aristotle, uh, we betray this thought when we think of it in terms of a specific notion of a divinity, when we think of it in terms of a concrete notion of a god. Um, because already in the the 400s BC or whenever, Aristotle's already pointing out that um, this is a matter of like the autonomy of thought, the spontaneity of thinking. This isn't about a particular notion of divinity. And to the extent that that's how the ancients thought about it, this is a kind of misrecognition or only partial statement of what's actually happening. And so I think there's good reason already, just based on resources internal to Aristotle, to contest a sort of theologizing vision of his thinking. But even if we don't grant that, um, it's clear that Aristotle wants to understand living beings in terms of an internal, what Kant thousands of years later would call like an internal form of purposiveness, a form of final causality that is internal to organisms and is not relative to a designer.
Hmm.
Now, the basic thought in Aristotle would be something like, when you think about the difference between like a hammer and a fox, or, you know, take your pick of living beings, uh, a hammer is obviously something that's arranged into parts to fulfill a specific function or purpose. But the purpose that it has is always relative to a designer,
Hmm.
relative to someone who wants to use it for something. In the case of a living organism, its only function is its own self perpetuation, its self maintenance, its self satisfaction in terms of its specific capacities. And on Aristotle's account, this is not relative to a designer in the same way that, an artifact is. So the original insight that Aristotle has is that to make sense of organisms, we have to have this conception of what living beings are that actually isn't reducible to a notion of design.
Hmm.
We have to have a notion of purpose that isn't reducible to a notion of design. And part of the worry within the materialist tradition has always been that if you appeal to any notion of purpose,
Hmm.
then you're automatically saddled with a notion of design.
Right.
But the Aristotelian, Kantian, Kant is a peculiar case for a number of reasons, which we don't have to get into, but basically Kant and Hegel, above all, they all three agree that to make sense of what living organisms are,
Hmm.
you need a distinct conception of purposiveness that is not actually reducible to arguments from design. And that's Aristotle's fundamental insight in the metaphysics and in De Anima. And beyond that, there's a further insight, which I'll just briefly go over, um, which is his stepladder argument.
Hmm.
So Aristotle he schematizes three kinds of living beings famously: plants, animals, and rational animals. And then God, or thought thinking itself, as I would prefer to say. And basically, what Aristotle wants to claim is that this is a stepladder because you start out with a form of nutrition at the level of plants,
Hmm.
where their main capacity is to metabolize resources in their external environment, um, by not by a sensible process, not by a rational process, but by a kind of like automatic or generic process. When you get to animals, you have the same form of nutrition or metabolism, but now it's mediated by aesthesis or perception, meaning that, animals have to go out in the world, they have to perceive shit, they have to discriminate one thing from another.
Hmm.
Am I going to go after this mouse or this mouse? In the case of a cat, whatever. They have a capacity for perception which enables them to pick out particulars, whereas in the case of plants, they're not picking out particulars. They just have a generic relationship to everything in their environment. Like, this a plant doesn't distinguish this pool of water from this pool of water. It doesn't distinguish, this sunlight from this sunlight. It's just, these are generic. But animals can make choices
Hmm.
about which particulars they pursue. And finally, in the case of animals like us, not only do we have nutritive and perceptive capacities, but we also have rational capacities, meaning that we can reason with each other about which things that we perceive that are worth pursuing or not. We can have debates about it. We can sit in a classroom and talk about what the good is or what is true and which sorts of things will satisfy our desires. And even more than that, which sorts of desires we should have and which sorts of desires we shouldn't have. So for Aristotle, it's very important, and for Hegel too, that these these do not constitute separate layers. But once you, and this is an argument that I've been making in a bunch of my recent papers, and that other people have argued in different ways, but um, that it's not as if like, okay, you have the nutritive capacity at the level of plants, and then on top of that, you have a perceptual capacity in animals, and then on top of that, you have a rational capacity in the case of us. It's rather that each capacity transforms the other capacities. So it's not just that animals have perceptual capacities in addition to nutritive ones, it's that perceptual capacities actually transform their nutritive capacities. It means that they can't so much feed themselves, they can't so much metabolize elements except by perceiving them. And the same is true in our case, that like if we didn't have our rational capacities, if tomorrow I were to lose my rational capacities, I wouldn't like suddenly, grow roots and be able to maintain myself, you know, without them. It's rather that like we actually reproduce ourselves as nutritive and perceptual beings only by virtue of our rational capacities as, these sorts of social and historical and normative creatures. Um, so, just to summarize, I think Aristotle's two great insights with respect to the question of life. Aristotle draws an absolutely indispensable distinction between artifacts and organisms, that these are two different ways of being proposive entities in the universe. And then he schematizes within being an internally proposive being three ways of doing that: vegetative, animal, rational animal. And then Hegel is going to take this up and radicalize it even further. But Aristotle is the starting point. Aristotle is the greatest thinker of organic logic that we've ever had.
Hmm. Why do you? This is kind of a side point, but I want to bring it up. One of the texts that I've been interested in the past is Cicero's On the Nature of Gods, where he is taking up like the Greek school positions at his time as a Roman and trying to engage in Greek philosophy because Greek philosophy was where philosophy was happening. The Romans, I guess, didn't care that much about philosophy, and so he wanted to directly engage with, in the form of a dialogue, Greek philosophy and the different schools of thought. And by that point, the like Stoic position that is kind of perceived as like the best position, the most logical position, um, is that everything has a final cause and a purpose, but that you can trace these up to God, basically, right? So humans must have been created, and they must have had a purpose, and so very much what we're familiar with, that there does actually have to be a God here, that we can't just end the story at humans being reflective in and of themselves. Rather, we actually have to keep tracing up in a traditional Christian way. And of course, like there's a character in the dialogues who's like skeptical of all of this and like critiques and undermines the Stoic position. And but Cicero ultimately says that he finds like the Stoic position the most compelling, and then Christians took up this text um, as a defense of Christianity, of course, in later centuries. So it seems like if it was the case that Aristotle articulated this, like this critical distinction, that this idea that really understood the purpose of humans as life, that wasn't kind of diluted by this kind of illusion that we create for ourselves about God. It seems like philosophy kind of very quickly got off the wrong track, if that is the case. I mean, do you think there were other sides that were upholding the Aristotelian perspective, or do you think it was just kind of like lost to history for that long? I mean, what happened between Aristotle and Hegel, basically?
Well, I mean, this is a great question. I mean, I think that, I mean, part of the problem with that model, with the Stoic model, is that you have a notion of the good and the true, which is completely divorced from any form of sensibility. And I mean, that's part of the whole idea, is that like we have to abstract away from our desire, and we have to
Hmm.
abstract away from, need. And Hegel's point, the phenomenology, when he, reflects on and provides this sort of critical examination of Stoicism, is that like, well, what happens when you do that? Your idea of the true and the good end up being completely empty,
Hmm.
because you can't actually specify any means in the fucking world to satisfying your notion of the true or your notion of the good. Like you can't actually make sense of like what would be required to fulfill your notion of the good if you've abstracted away all sensible means to determining what's good.
Hmm.
So his point is that you end up with a vacuous notion of the true and the good. And there's another argument, which is that like, well, if you trace this up to God, and eventually you're going to need some conception of something that has an internal purpose. So let's say that God is the final good, and that we're just means to the fulfillment of that final good. Fine. Okay. We can accept this for the sake of argument. But if you trace that all the way up the ladder, and you get to the point where God himself is the only creature in the universe that has an internal purpose, you're still going to need to be able to account for the internal purpose of God. And to do that, you're going to have to give an account of like, okay, what's God's internal purpose? God's internal purpose is to maintain himself as God. And what does that mean?
Hmm.
Well, for God to have the internal purpose of maintaining himself as God, such that he specifies all of these different means, creations, and so forth for doing so, God is also going to have sensible capacities for specifying those means. God is also going to have, all of this. Basically, the point would be that God is going to have to be finite,
Hmm.
because the only kind of creature that has to maintain itself, that has to do something to satisfy its internal purpose, is one that can die. So
Right.
then you're suddenly saddled with the notion of God that can die.
Hmm.
And what kind of God is that? Now you're back at a superhuman, basically a superhuman who has designed all other humans, who himself has to have internal purpose such that, he can maintain himself and pick out the relevant ends and means in the world to do so. And in that case, you know, you've just kicked the problem back to the ultimate level. And then why do we need God to make sense of the whole problem? So I think either Stoicism is vacuous, because it can't actually make sense of how you pick out like the means to the satisfaction of the good, or Stoicism is dependent on a notion of divinity, which has to be finite, in which case it's not divinity in the relevant sense anymore. So I think both of those things, from the Hegelian standpoint, they rule out like a Stoic conception of, these sorts of solutions. Um, and I think you'd asked one other counterparts to this question, which I've now forgotten. What was the?
Yeah, part of it is what is the explanation for kind of the gap between Aristotle and Hegel? Like, what was everyone else
Okay,
doing? Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. So after Aristotle, it is true that for a long time, I mean, you have Aquinas, you have uh, various Christian thinkers who try to repurpose, as it were, the notion of purpose.
Hmm.
Um, and, then you get to the early modern tradition, and you get to Descartes and Leibniz and so on. And with Descartes in particular, you get this very hard sort of form of mechanism where, we're just sort of extended things, mechanical bodies, so on. In Spinoza, you get the absolute elimination of teleology. I mean, as Kant famously says, like Spinoza's God is a dead God, because Spinoza's God isn't proposive. It's just determined by a form of mechanical causality. It's
Mm.
efficient causality all the way up and all the way down, grounded in the principle of sufficient reason, at least according to Michael Della Rocca. Uh, and the one thinker from that moment who sort of protested and had something else to say is, interestingly enough, it's Leibniz. And Leibniz comes along and says, well, no one's really accounting for the role of final causality.
Mm.
We need a distinction between final and efficient causality. We need some notion of how things are supposed to be, which has been fundamentally dismissed in Spinoza, doesn't really exist in Descartes. And so Leibniz actually tries to revive this notion of final causality that Aristotle had originally articulated. Um, his version of this is, sort of subordinated to his like theodicy and account of like the grand purpose of, history and so on. And it's really not until Kant um, that you get a rigorous rethinking of the Aristotelian idea of the internally proposive character of the organism. And obviously, the Kantian account has many limitations. It's seen as subjectivist and regulative and all this stuff. Like, for Kant, it's not, uh, um, all of this is sort of for us. Kant doesn't think that this actually like applies as an objective constraint on the natural world. And it's not until Hegel that you actually get a return to this original Aristotelian idea that no, there are final causes in nature itself, and not just for us as human actors, and not just within, this Theodosian account of the history of the world, as in Leibniz. So in a way, like, um, yeah, it's kind of a purloined letter. Like it goes lost, it goes missing after Aristotle for a long time, except sort of through this Christian tradition, it survives in a way, but in a kind of distorted form. And it's only within the German idealist tradition that you really have this very strong return to a certain form of Aristotelianism. And the reasons for that, I mean, hard to say. Yeah, I mean, I don't have uh, a great account of why that is, except that you know, part of the initial cost of the modern scientific revolution and this idea of nature's independence from human activity and its explicability in terms of mechanism, mechanical laws, and Newton and so on. Um, yeah, this did mean a certain disenchantment of nature and a suppression of its character as a book. Nature is a book, and the sort of to use the classical metaphor. Um, and it was only Hegel who was able to sort of re-rationalize this thought and recover the idea that there's a way to think about purposiveness and teleology in the natural world that doesn't re-enchant it,
Mm.
that doesn't actually commit us to the idea that God is the creator of all that there is within nature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I wanted to talk more about Hegel generally, and I have some thoughts about subjectivity that I want to go into a bit more. Um, so one of them is basically I was having an argument with some people in a live stream one time about basically I was making a very simplistic point, which was that um, Hegel recognizes. I think Hegel in the philosophy of right basically says that there's a part where he's talking about the state, and he's talking about religious people who are kind of criticizing the state abstractly, And he's basically saying, you don't if you don't understand the internal logic, the internal justification, necessity of the state, you're not really in a position to critique it. Like you're not really playing the game. Like you're kind of just outside of things, and there's a problem there. And so I was basically maintaining that argument and saying that at some level you have to have a familiarity with the ultimate purpose, the necessity of things in order to critique them. And the objection that I heard was that that was sort of a right Hegelianism, where in trying to distinguish like the levels of knowing that someone can have was something that is right Hegelianism in some way, and that rather what I guess the non-right Hegelians would say is that there's some form of knowing that we all have of the state that allows us to critique it in substantive way. And so yeah, I was curious if you would agree that is right Hegelianism, or what you think about that point in general.
Wait, so the thought is that uh, rearticulate what's the idea that's supposed to be right Hegelian here?
Specifically, that you need to have like that knowledge, that deeper knowledge of what the purpose of the state is. Like you actually have to know and be familiar with the necessity. You can't just randomly have an insight. You have to actually deeply be aware of that knowledge and kind of work for it.
No, I mean, like, okay, so if we take up Marx's own view that communism, again, is the riddle of history solved, what does that mean? Well, to solve a riddle is, to give a certain, I mean, it's to give a solution, it's to understand what something means. It's to understand what something means. And what something means in the practical realm is to understand what its purpose is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is the purpose of history? That's what Marx is saying. What is the purpose of history? And specifically, he's trying to understand, a certain form of collectivity and a certain form of collective unity as the purpose of history. And to say that, like, if we want to understand what history means, what all this suffering has been for, what we've all been trying to achieve this whole time, that's what communism is. And, you know, I mean, he and Engels, I mean, they both had complicated relationship to the notion of the state. I mean, they interpret it narrowly or broadly, depending on the context. But basically, what they want to say is that um, communism amounts to a form of collective self organization and to a form of collective deliberation that would be truly rational,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that individuals could participate in it for a reason that makes sense. That's the basic idea. And Hegel's point in the philosophy of right is to say, um, I'm going to give you an account philosophically of how we can make sense of what it means to say that there's a certain form of collective unity or deliberation that makes sense over other forms of collective unity or deliberation. Now, Hegel has a very specific answer to this question, and he gives an account that, you know, is widely detested by many people for good reason. There are all sorts of flaws in it. But we need to make a distinction between the attempt to give such an account and the account itself. Now, Hegel can be absolutely fucking wrong about the details and still be right about the need to be able to justify the kind of world that we think would be rational and that we should be going in for, that we should be struggling for. And specifically, when Hegel defines the state, well, how does Hegel define the state? Hegel defines the state more or less as like, what is the fundamental principle for making sense of how a form of life hangs together? How all the institutions in a form of life make sense together? How the state in a narrow sense, how the economy, how the family, how commercial life, how even our understanding of friendship, how all of these things, how religion, how all of these things make sense. Like why this specific set of things go together at a specific point in time. And what Hegel is after is an account of like, okay, well, what would be the principle for a set of things that actually works, that actually fucking makes sense and that people can sustain and hold together and justify to each other
Hmm.
and care about such that, you know, it doesn't generate uh, consistent conflict over time. That's what he's concerned with. What Hegel is not saying is that, well, whatever is the case is rational, or whatever form of the state we have is rational. Um, there's nothing right wing or, you know, untoward about the idea of what he's trying to do. In fact, what Hegel is trying to do is subject our conception of how we should live to critical scrutiny. And he's trying to say, like, you need to be able to justify to other people, to other philosophers, you need to be able to justify to other theoreticians and to other practical actors why you think that your conception of the world is a good conception of how things should be. And clearly, Marx and Engels are committed to this because otherwise, like, how are you going to organize anyone? How are you going to turn to workers and say, like, this is what you should be struggling for?
Mm.
This is how life should look. Unless you have, and this doesn't mean that you can't get it wrong. This doesn't mean that, like, philosophers are always right. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that it's necessary to try to get it right, which is a very different point. And so I don't think that there's anything right wing about it. I think, in fact, like it's the most left wing thing that you can do is to try to critically reflect on what your principles are and why you think things should be a certain way. And when it comes to the state in particular, the whole point is that, like, yeah, we need some way of figuring out how to decide things together and how to live together. And in the most capacious sense for Hegel, like all the state is, all the notion that all that the notion of the state means is what are our principles for living together? That's really what he means. And if that's the case, then I think the point becomes, much less controversial because then it's just about like, okay, yeah, this is something that we should debate. This is something that you should be able to have reasons for, and that you shouldn't just, impose on people, sort of willy-nilly. Like, how can you justify this to other people such that they would find satisfaction in the principles that you're offering to them? That's the point. And ultimately, I think Hegel gives us the method for doing that. Marx and Engels give us the substance. They give us the critique of capital that shows like why our current form of life and why our current form of the state is defective, will not work for most people, and why we need to radically reconsider the way that we live. And they have good reasons for why we should contest it and why we should change things. But if you want to ground those reasons and you want to be able to say like where those reasons come from, they don't just drop from the heavens, then you're going to need a method like Hegel's. That's the thought.
Right. One of the things that I'm more, coming from a more liberal perspective, one of the things that I'm skeptical of in, I guess, Hegel philosophically, but also how Marxists would interpret it, is the idea of like our self-consciousness changing over time. So I'm skeptical of and have a hard time with the idea that there was something fundamentally different about the level of consciousness that, like an ancient person had. I think they had like a different, a different form, or it took a different shape, but the substance wasn't necessarily different. That the pieces they were using were the same in some way. And the reason I make that point is because people will often essentially say, if you ultimately when we're having these kind of philosophical debates, they're there so that if I say something like, well, our liberal democratic system is necessary because it organizes the state in the best way you're going to get, where you can regulate and mediate, different interests of society, different groups, whatever. And so you need a form of that, not like not in the sense of we need to have the same system forever, but we need a kind of liberal state. And so Marxists who are taking a more philosophical perspective, they'll say, sure, you think that because you're in bourgeois consciousness. And what we need to do is we need to fundamentally change our consciousness in such a way that we would not need, like law in the same way, like you mentioned. Like we would have an internalized set of laws because we would have a different type of consciousness and we wouldn't need this formal set of laws. Whereas I would say I'm not convinced that we would be able to eliminate the need for legal formalism, for example. We should, increase, we should sharpen legal formalism to be more just, but that doesn't mean we can, get rid of it principally, which is what you would want to do. So, what do you think about like that objection? How would you respond to that? How do you think you can resolve that problem about the
Great,
development?
great, great question. I mean, I would invert the point. I would say that like uh, the form in a certain way is what persists, the substance is what changes. So the Hegelian idea that um, so for Hegel, self-consciousness uh, is, you know, one way to put it is that like in doing anything, you're conscious of what you're doing. In thinking anything, you're conscious of what you're thinking. Which means that when I'm walking down the street, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm walking down the street. I'm conscious of the rules that govern what it means to walk down the street. When I'm, having a debate with you, or when I'm articulating my belief about what, I don't know, food I like best, I'm conscious of the rules that govern those kinds of debates, and so I'm sensitive to them. And that means that I know what moves are right and what moves are wrong within that sphere. Like, if I suddenly start talking to you about, I don't know, like, uh, I don't know, the quality of a symphony or whatever within the context of a debate about food, like, I'm going drastically wrong. Like, this is outside of the rules. Or if I'm walking down the street and, I suddenly start, trying to fly, like, clearly I'm like violating the rules of the activity that I'm trying to pursue. And I'm no longer really participating in that. Or in like the most famous examples, if I'm playing chess and I decide to move my pawn 5 spaces ahead, I'm like no longer really playing chess. Like to do these things is to be sensitive to the rules that govern these activities, and that just is what it means to be self-conscious. The distinction between a game and a practice is that games are set, like you're just agreeing to what is the case. We all know how chess works, etc. No one's trying to revolutionize the rules of chess. But when it comes to other practices like that aren't games, they're always open to a certain level of contestation. We can always ask, like, what it means. It's not just that we always can, it's that we're always in the process of trying to figure out what it means to do something well or poorly. So, in the case of the state, for instance, there are certain rules that govern what it means to be a member of a state, or what it means to be a ruler of a state. And that's something that we're trying to figure out over time, and that it's something that changes. And it's part of the self-consciousness of that process that, like, we're always asking, like, you know, are my actions qua member of the state or qua ruler of the state, are they justified? And are they justifiable to the other participants in this institution, etc.? So that's part of the Hegelian picture, is that we're always engaged in the process of revising our institutions to some degree or another. Um, I think that like uh, when it comes to the question of legal formalism, and whether legal formalism is something that can come or go, whether this is um, I mean, I agree with you that there's always going to need to be some form of law. Like I think the utopian idea that we can just like wash away law wipe it away as if it's some inessential residue is incorrect because we're fundamentally rule-bound creatures, and that's just part of what it is to be self-conscious. And what it is to be self-conscious at the collective level is that we give ourselves rules that we share and that we hold each other to, and that, we um, that these are the conditions for both agreement and disagreement, basically. So then it's a question not so much of like if one conflates like the legal formalism characteristic of capitalist modernity with rule following as such, I think that's a problem. I think what we have to ask is we have to say like legality as such is constitutive of what it means to be a self-conscious sort of animal. And then we can ask what sort of legality ought we to have? And I think part of what Marx's analysis makes so palpable and what's so powerful about it is that it shows that the kind of legal formalism that we've had is actually inconsistent with what it promises. That legal formalism on the sort of capitalist bourgeois conception, it can't actually secure the equality and the freedom and the democratic self-determination that it claims to.
Mm.
So it's not about getting rid of rules. It's not about getting rid of legality. It's about, I think what Hegel has shown is that legality is actually constitutive. This is like just an a priori condition of human life. Then the question becomes, okay, how do we reformulate what it means to be a law-bound creature such that we avoid the pitfalls of legal formalism and actually figure out a way to internalize rules or laws on the level of on the individual such that they're actually satisfying, such that on the one hand, like I as an individual can take satisfaction in following these rules, and on the other hand, they can actually function as conditions for our uh, self-consistent communal engagement over time, such that they don't generate contradictions and various forms of domination. So that would be the thought.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I totally understand the idea. I guess what I'm interested in is the metaphysical justification for that idea, because I do think that it's kind of taken for granted at kind of like a moral level that we want things to change. We want things to be more perfect. We want things to be better. And, we can use Hegel to do that, but ultimately people are taking that kind of moral stance where they're just saying that things must be able to be better than what they are. And so what I'm saying is I need to be, I want it proven that there is this necessary development of, society in such a way that we can overcome certain forms. Because I don't think, I'm not making some kind of argument that, our current form of law is the best form of law and everything about it is perfect. I would never make that argument. But I am making the argument that saying that you have to justify more to me I need to hear it more justified to believe that there's something about human consciousness itself that would allow for a kind of legal system that had no legal formalism at all. Which I know you're not saying no law, but it does feel like you're basically saying no legal formalism, no modern day legal system. And so, what would that look like? How can I be convinced that that's possible when, um,
Okay,
yeah,
two things. Two things. All right, so it depends on what we mean by legal formalism. What I mean by legal formalism is a system of laws that are procedurally generated that are actually more or less indifferent to the um, uh, diverse situations of actual actors within society, such that laws can disproportionately affect one population over another.
mm,
I mean, for Marx, the most pointed example of this are property laws, where it privileges one class over another. But I mean, there are many others, like, you know, I mean, laws about, you know, uh, I don't know, like, we decide that certain laws about certain drugs are they increase the amount of violence and crime in society, but those laws end up disproportionately affecting African Americans, whatever, this sort of thing. Um, where there's no actual attention to how the laws are grounded in a form of political economy and how the laws are related to the economic form of life that they're actually helping to produce and sustain, where you do have deep inequality that's generated by this property relation. Where, as soon as you have laws that secure something like private appropriation, you're going to have deep inequality in society due to our specific history. That's going to disproportionately affect, some populations over against others, some races over against others, and so on. So the idea is not that we need to get rid of laws that have universal efficacy. It's the idea that we have to get rid of laws that have a kind of positivistic or formalistic nature in the sense that um, you know, they're not actually um, uh, they're not actually generating, or they're not actually conditions of justice for all people. They're creating conditions of injustice, just by the fact that they're formalistically applied to everyone without any attention to the different situations of different populations. That's the point about legal formalism. What I wouldn't want to say is that we shouldn't have laws that apply to everyone. Obviously, I would reject that. The very notion of law, just intrinsic to the notion of law, is the notion of universality. Like, if there's a law, it's going to apply to everyone, clearly. Um, as for the idea that things need to be better, and whether that's just a moralistic sort of imposition, or whether it's something I'm just sort of, legislating from the outside, I think the thought would be something like this. If we follow the kind of analysis that Marx gives, and if Marx's analysis actually holds, and Marx is able to actually demonstrate that the system of law that we have and the system of political economy that we have generate, just a priori, internal to the very nature of how our society is organized, these forms of dissatisfaction and contradiction, then one can show that by the lights of our own commitment to freedom and equality within our form of life, within the bourgeois capitalist form of life, one can show that given what we're already committed to, that things are not what they should be. One doesn't have to say how things should be in some abstract sense.
Hmm.
One can say that, like, no, we're committed to a certain notion of individual freedom. We're committed to a certain notion of democratic self-determination, and we're committed to a certain notion of egalitarianism. But the point is that given how society is configured, like all of these values that we have, like they can't actually be fulfilled. And so one only has to point to the things that, one, we already care about, and two, the practices that we're already sustaining to show that things aren't what they should be. One doesn't have to point to any abstract imperative about like how things should be. One can point just simply to the internal configuration and the defects internal to that system to demonstrate that life should be different than it is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, my response, I think any liberal who actually believes in anything and is actually taking up this question meaningfully has to engage with that question. But I would just say that anyone who is doing that, and what I would say is that it that law is not just law isn't just formal. That what you're considering the downsides of our current legal system, I would say are indeed downsides, but ones that can be corrected within the liberal system, right? So the thought is that civil society within the liberal order can, we can legislate what our laws will be, and that's obviously the whole point of having a legislature and having it be elected, is that our laws are democratically managed, that our laws are created with the intent of serving a universal purpose. Now we can make mistakes, But I would argue that just because there are you know just because there are issues with the particular manifestation of that principle doesn't mean that the liberal system itself is flawed. And that's my hesitation with a lot of the Marxist critique of saying that the system kind of critiques itself is I do actually think that you have to buy into a future. You have to buy into an ought, because if you don't buy into the ought, the contradiction can be resolved within itself. That would be the thought. That would be the counter argument. Is yes,
Good.
sure, liberal democracy contradicts itself, but it can within itself resolve that contradiction. Not that we necessarily need to transcend it. And I think that buying into that premise that we need to transcend it is what I'm taking issue with.
Right. Okay. But so the way that a couple things. I mean, great point. But I think that the Hegelian procedure is to show that when you have a contradiction within a form of life, um, partly what that shows is that, you know, if not this, then that.
Hmm.
That's the basic Hegelian formulation. That if you can show that there's something determinately wrong with this, and more than that, that there's something determinately wrong with this, but in a way that points beyond itself. Because within what we're looking at, there's some kernel of promise that the system in question itself can't realize. It's saying, I want to give you this. This is what I want to give you. This is the thing that people care about. This is what people want. However, given the way that we're trying to realize this, we have to go in for this instead.
Hmm.
That's the thought.
Hmm.
So Hegel thinks that determinate negation, what a determinate negation is if not this, then that. So that's like the logical principle of motion. Now, when it comes to the Marxist critique of capital, the thought would be that, like, okay, like, well, let's think about the commodity form. Let's think about how exchange works. Let's think about how private property works. If we trace the logic from the commodity form, from the idea that things have like a use value and an exchange value, we think about the fact that like the exchangeability of things is ultimately determined by their value, which is determined by the amount of labor time that they contain. And if we think about how what it means for things to be measured in labor time means that labor has to be exchanged for a wage. And if we think about the preconditions for exchanging things for a wage, and that is equivalent to someone privately owning the means of production and my having to expend my labor, in order to attain the means for my own subsistence. If we follow that argument all the way through, Marx's point is that you constitutively produce a form of inequality, not just a form of inequality, but a form of domination, where, in Marx's time and the way that he framed the argument, partly what you're producing is an increasingly immiserated working class. You're increasing more and more poverty. In the 20th century, to some degree, this started to disappear. We figured out a way to make conditions, at least superficially, more equitable. However, what was actually happening is that we were creating a managerial class in the United States and shipping off the poverty to, other countries, and we were creating no longer an international, uh, you know, form of inequality, but now an international one. So this is taking place, especially under neoliberal conditions. Um, but the basic idea still holds that uh, there's constitutive inequality, and more than constitutive inequality, there's constitutive domination, meaning that, you know, no one can actually find satisfaction consistently in the labor that they have to perform to survive. And capitalists themselves they find themselves having to perform um, operations of extraction and appropriation just in order to compete with other capitalists. And this is also a form of unfreedom. So the point of the picture is that like the system is supposed to offer freedom and satisfaction in the work that you do, Um, but it actually can't fulfill the promise that it's offering. And that's not a contingent fact. This is actually just a condition of this form of production. Like, as soon as you have a distinction between capital and labor, you know, private property and, individual production, uh, you're going to generate this contradiction where individuals are trying to find the means to satisfy their own ends and to live free lives. But ultimately, the only way to do that is to submit to a system of unfreedom
Hmm.
where they're forced to do things that they don't want to do. And they're participating in a process that leads to mass inequality at a certain point between the two classes. So the overriding thought is that inequality is not a it's not a bug, it's a feature of the system. And unfreedom is not a bug, it's a feature of the system. And Marx has like a super compelling account of why this is the case. And if one is going to contest this and claim that, like, well, we can achieve freedom within the system, we can achieve democracy within the system, we can achieve equality within the system, one would have to go, toe to toe with that account and show that, Marx's picture actually doesn't work. And, I think that's the burden. I mean, he has shown that under certain assumptions, this is what will happen. Um, and this is a massive form of unfreedom, and this does contradict the sort of freedom that we're offered. So for the liberal, um, that's a challenge, at least as I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that challenge or even the resolution of that challenge. My issue, I guess, is going back to the original point you made about negation and about contradiction in Hegel,
Yeah,
which is that I'm not convinced. That is probably the biggest issue I have with Hegel. I think Hegel makes a lot of sense in terms of understanding the way that things are and the unity of the universal and the particular and like these different things I think are very useful. But the idea that there is a necessity in contradiction, that if you find a contradiction, there necessarily has to be something else that it has to develop in some way. That's the part that I'm very skeptical of. And so I wonder, like, if I gave you the ultimately skeptic, you know, prove to me that there's inherently negation. What is your like best argument in favor of that metaphysical justification? Because I do think that is the most important part, and it's the one that I have the biggest problem with in Hegel.
great. Well, so first of all, like the sense of necessity here, it's not, and I've said this many times in print and elsewhere, but the point for Hegel is it's not a matter of like there has to be this development in the same way that water, has to boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever. His point is that there's a normative necessity. This is what ought to happen, given what we're committed to, given where we are. That doesn't mean that it will happen.
Hmm.
And so, like in the case of our form of life, like there is no fucking guarantee at all that we're actually going to, deliver the communist utopia. I mean, Postone makes a distinct, Moishi Postone, the Marx scholar, makes this distinction, which I think is useful here between like what will probably happen and what's possible that will happen. I think it's extremely improbable that we will ever achieve the kind of emancipatory form of life that I'm talking about. Do I think it's possible? Absolutely.
Hmm.
And it's only because of that possibility, which is a practical possibility, meaning it's something that we could do, but won't necessarily will do. I think that's part of the key is that the kind of necessity that Hegel is talking about is a practical necessity. It's not a causal necessity.
Hmm.
It's not a metaphysical necessity.
Hmm.
And when he gives a sort of retrospective account that he's given of prior history, the way the account is meant to go is like, you know, given what this form of life was, this is what could and ought to have happened, and we can make sense of why what did happen did happen.
Hmm.
We can show why this did happen, not that it must have in some sort of causal sense. And similarly, I think that under the most charitable interpretation, Marx's point is not that this will happen. His point is that, it could and ought to happen, not that it will. And so there's a two different senses of necessity at play. One is a typical causal one, which I think both Hegel and Marx would reject. And then there's a practical normative one, which I think that they would both affirm. And that's where their accounts are playing out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a. I'm thinking of Schopenhauer's like one of Schopenhauer's critiques of Hegel about gravity, where basically he says that doesn't make any sense. How could you say something is heavier because of gravity? When my understanding was that what Hegel was doing there was not saying that that the object was actually heavier, but rather explaining what's going on when we try to understand gravity. That our way of
Correct.
understanding and dealing with gravity. So I think that would be an
Yes.
example of what you're saying is that it's not about the metaphysical the truth of the thing. It's about the metaphysical truth that arises out of our grappling with the metaphysics. Our our engaging with it, our unraveling of that. So that makes sense to me. I understand that. I saw you mention somewhere that Heidegger you think is like one of the best, maybe the best critics of Hegel, and that if you're going to defend Hegel, you should have a way of responding to that. So what do you think? What do you think that Heidegger is offering that makes him like a significant opponent to what Hegel is offering there?
Well, so uh, so Robert Pippin's recent work, part of what he's tried to show is Pippin's had this like sort of Heideggerian turn.
Hmm.
Pippin, for those who don't know, is a lifelong scholar and defender of the Hegelian position. And within the past 10 years or so, he's had this sort of Heideggerian turn. And this was in part, I think, prompted by recent political events and his pessimism about where we're headed. And this led him to believe that, contra Hegel, there is no reason in history that the Heideggerian position that history is this kind of like contingent unfolding and that there is no telos might be right.
Hmm.
And Pippin tries to ground this in a deeper way by showing that in Heidegger's engagement in particular with Hegel's science of logic, partly what Heidegger tries to do is to show that without getting into all of the details of this, which are complex, that in the opening of Hegel's Science of Logic, Hegel tries to give an account of uh, what it means for things to be. Hegel's trying to think, okay, like we talk about what being is, and there are all these accounts of what it means to be. And the first account in sort of the history of philosophy and the pre-Socratics is Parmenides, where being is just what is. It's just
Hmm.
pure positive being. Where Parmenides wants to say that anything that isn't, uh, you know, it is not, and anything that is, that's what being is.
Hmm.
So Parmenides wants to eliminate any form of negativity or negation. So like I don't know if we talk about like a lie or uh, like a sophist who is not a philosopher. These are all forms of non-being, and so therefore they are not.
Hmm.
Like a lie is not the truth, so therefore it is not. Um, and partly what Hegel wants to show is that this is an incoherent notion of what it means to be, uh, because to say that anything is at all, you need to be able to say that this is not that. And that means that minimally there's some negation involved. If this is not that, then, there's some negative determination. There's something that it is not. So we need to be able to use negation to establish what it means to be. Uh, Heidegger's criticism of this claim is that Hegel is presupposing a criterion of determinacy, that Hegel is sort of loading the dice and trying to say that uh, built into any conception of being is this distinction between this and that. This is not this. And Heidegger wants to say that Hegel's basically just helping himself to this, that
Mm.
he's just assumed this in advance. And so the Heideggerian position is to say that um, Hegel's wrong to assume determinacy is the criterion of being, and Heidegger goes his own route. And I'm not going to get into that, but to show that being shouldn't be so understood, that being is much more historically mutable, and that Hegel's own idea of determinacy or criterion of determinacy is it's actually a historical criterion. It's not the ultimate criterion. That's his fundamental point. Um, why I think that Pippin is right, that this makes Heidegger the most powerful critic of Hegel, is that in a way, I mean, Heidegger is basically using Hegel's own method against himself and saying that, like, your whole thing is to try to show that, you know, uh, exposition is presupposing Y, and you're not fully thinking through Y, and uh, we need to be critical about what our underlying conception of Y is, and you're failing to do that. And you yourself are doing this. You yourself are presupposing some sort of criterion that you've not justified.
Mm.
And so Pippin thinks that Heidegger gets a lot of mileage out of this and is able to articulate a really fundamental critique. And the upshot of this, politically and socially and otherwise, is that, um, yeah, that Heidegger thinks that, to put it in a slogan, if Hegel wants to say that the fundamental purpose or end or telos of history is human freedom, Heidegger wants to say that that's premised on this very question begging and distorted idea that we can define being in terms of determinacy,
Mm-hmm.
what makes things X versus Y. And Heidegger wants to reject this and say that, like, well, as soon as you've said that freedom is the end of human life, you've already slotted human beings into this criterion of determinacy, and you've already assumed too much. So Heidegger wants to say that no, we don't have a fundamental end. There is no fundamental telos of human life. There is no fundamental way that the world should be. Uh, there just is the sort of contingent movement of history. Um, Now, for many reasons, I think this is incoherent and that Heidegger can't ultimately hold to this position, but it does represent a very valuable challenge to what the Hegelian is trying to do, because it allows the Hegelian to uh, defend the method of the system as a whole, which is to say, like, well, okay, Heidegger, you want to say that determinacy is not, and that freedom is not the fundamental criterion of human life. Well, as soon as you say that it's not the criterion of human life, that means that you're offering something else that is. You're making some sort of determinate distinction yourself. You're also trying to say something about how we should understand ourselves. And if that's the case, then Heidegger's still playing the game. He's still within the Hegelian logic. He's still trying to tell us something about what it means to be a person. And he can't just appeal to this abstract and indeterminate notion um, for Hegel without falling back into some, point of differentiation, some way of saying that if we're not this, then we're that. So on the one hand, I think that Heidegger is offering a very important critique of the Hegelian position, but on the other hand, unlike Robert Pippin, I don't think that this actually succeeds.
Hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. So yeah, last thing here, you've got the book coming out in a couple of weeks, True Materialism, which we were talking about earlier, about Aristotle and Hegel and Marx and the writers like Kafka. What do you mind? Would you tell us like what you're working on next? What's your next projects? What you're working on?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm working on the book I'm working on now. It's called Hegel's Bioaesthetics. And it tries to, there's some of this already in the book that's coming out in a couple weeks. But as I explained at the very beginning, the book that I've just finished is both on the modernist novel and on sort of Hegel, Aristotle, Marx. This next book is it's just a purely philosophical project, and partly what it's trying to do is to show that there are all these sort of fundamental debates within 20th century philosophy of art, and um, you have above all the Heideggerian and Adornian challenges to Hegel's aesthetics. And what the book is trying to show is that the major oversight of both thinkers is that um, Hegel actually grounds his aesthetics in a metaphysics of life,
Mm,
um, and that both uh, Heidegger and Adorno they both ignore this aspect of Hegel's thinking, and I think it leads them to formulate alternatives that are ultimately distorted. And they oppose Hegel's position without taking into consideration the role that the category of the organic plays in Hegel's thought. So the fundamental aim of the book is to recover what I'm calling Hegel's bioaesthetics, which is this idea that um, you know the common wisdom about Hegel is that he rejects the idea of natural beauty and prioritizes the idea of art beauty.
mm,
And this is an inversion of the sort of Kantian move, which is to say that natural beauty is higher than
mm,
art beauty. But in fact, Hegel's starting point in his aesthetics, when he's giving his account of what beauty is, he starts with the notion of the living being.
mm,
And what I'm trying to do is to recover that account and to show that far from rejecting natural beauty, Hegel's actually trying to show that one, it's been misunderstood. Two, it's grounded in the notion of like the unity of a living organism.
mm.
And three, that this is the true paradigm for what beauty is. And if you want to understand art beauty, you have to start with the idea of the beauty of other living beings. And if we take this on board, it enables us to solve all of these big debates within 20th century aesthetics.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah. Really appreciate you coming you on. Coming on. Yeah, it was really good talking about more about Hegel and Heidegger, and yeah, some of my problems with Hegel. Yeah, really appreciate you coming on. It was really nice having you on. And once again, everyone, please check out the book. I'm definitely going to read it myself. And yeah, thank you for being here. And thank you everyone for watching.
Thanks a lot, man. Good night.